After we have some information about the history of Europe, now we have to come back to the present. And I would like to ask the moderator of our first panel, Anna Maria Csiszér from the Hungarian Pan-European, to start with the first table. The title is Combating Euroscepticism with More Europe.
Dear panelists, dear audience, welcome to this first discussion. I would rather call it a roundtable discussion, as this is how we imagined it. So I will ask some questions that will function as a driving force, and then we will discuss the topic of Euroscepticism. So basically this panel is titled Euroscepticism, which is something like the keyword of this conference. So we really hope that it will give a good basics of the further discussions of these 2 days. So we have in this panel Mr. Mahacek from the Czech Republic, who is a columnist, musician, and university lecturer. He covers political, economic, European, and geopolitical issues. Currently, he publishes his columns in the Czech daily newspaper Lidové noviny. In 2015, he became a chairman of the Board of Trustees of the Institute for Politics and Society, and he also takes part in setting up the strategy and the agenda of this think tank. Mr. Mahacek is also a professor of journalism at the New York University of Prague. Yeah, I think that's all, if I'm not mistaken. We also have in the panel Mr. Charles Non from Slovenia. And basically, if I might share with the audience, he just told me that he has some Hungarian connections, as his partner is Hungarian, so he knows a few Hungarian words, and he is very much dedicated to Hungarian topics. So he understands. Okay, so he's a press correspondent and analyst based in Slovenia since 2013, where he basically covers topics mostly from Slovenia, but also the Western Balkans. He has writings in many different various outlets, such as the French online newspaper Le Courrier des Balkans and the Slovenian think tank Homo Politicus. He also worked at the European Commission in the Directorate General in charge of enlargement and neighborhood policies. And what he told about himself is concerning his research fields and interest is the Western Balkans and enlargement policy, Central Europe, and European politics in general. We do not have here yet, but will soon come, Mr. Szabolcs Janik, who is currently the Deputy Director of Migration Research Institute. He has obtained a degree at Corvinus University in Budapest. He studied international economics and business, and also political science. Previously, he worked at the Institute for Public Policy Research as an economist. He also worked for the Institute for Foreign Policy, Foreign Affairs and Trade. He also worked for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And since 2 years, he is, first he started as a researcher in the Migration Research Institute, and since a couple of months, he became Deputy Director of this institute. So let's start the first round. We have heard in the opening addresses and also in the opening speech that basically the European Union is facing challenges, is facing one of the rockiest periods of its existence. The traditional European values are currently challenged, both by political disunity on European level and raising distrust against European institutions and European integration as such. So basically we can say that the European Union has reached its breaking point, and at the same time it's very much reliant on public support in order to have its continuous legitimacy. So basically I suggest that public opinion is cannot really be characterized as either Eurosceptic or not. We can say that there are different types of Euroscepticism, and basically these types of Euroscepticisms coincide with fundamentally different views about the way how the EU should be reformed. What is your opinion about these different types of Euroscepticisms, or how would you characterize these types? If you agree with my suggestions that we have different types of Euroscepticisms at all. You have a microphone there, and please pass it on. Let's start with Mr. Mahacek.
Okay, so thanks for being invited here. I am very glad that I can participate in this interesting little conference. And first, let me say that it's quite a nice paradox for me speaking here, because it's a conference which is associated with Habsburg family, as I understand it, and in 2 days our country celebrates 100 years of independence. I am going back to Prague on it tomorrow, so it's a nice paradox. I have nothing against it, but it's certainly funny that it's my first encounter with this institution and with Mr. Habsburg in my life. So it's a great timing. I like it because I like paradoxes. I should also say a little bit at the beginning something more about myself connected with Europe, because I also used to be a chairman of Václav Havel's library, which is an institution devoted to our former president. And I was trying as much as I could to establish the institution that it not only emphasizes the role of Václav Havel as a dissident and president, but also as a European, and because he wrote many great speeches on Europe, and it was his very important topic for him. And I also started a conference there, which is still going and happening, called Václav Havel's European Dialogues. When I was basically fired from this institution, I was asked to start this think tank, Institute for Politics and Society, which you might find it also paradoxical. It's now the institute which is close to the government party, and so we are also advising to Prime Minister on European issues. And that's life. We also do a conference which is called Annual International Conference, which is called Multiple Challenges on Europe. And in this, it's associated with what you mentioned, because originally we wanted to call the conference Multiple Crises in Europe. But since we do it on the annual basis, we found it a little bit strange to call something which we want to create like a sustainable annual conference to have a crisis in the name. So challenges sound more positive. So now it's called Multiple Challenges for Europe. And so I absolutely agree that Europe is facing many challenges: migration, Eurozone, assertive Russia, among others, and also very complicated institutional structure, which I find which I will speak about more in detail. So I agree with you. There are different kinds of skepticism, of Euroscepticism. One of them is like purely ideological, connected also very often with the interests of countries which would like to see EU weakened or unstable, etc. So, and it's deliberate effort to weaken Europe and deliberate effort to make EU less efficient. But let's not speak about it, because I think much more persistent Euroscepticism is associated or is somehow misused, but it's easy to be misused because EU is overcomplicated. It's so European Union. If you want to get if you want to lower the level of skepticism or fight Euroscepticism, we should try some effort. We should be more active in proposing how to make EU more simple, more transparent, more understandable, and it's, to be honest, very complicated, because I understand, even if you are someone who is like professionally involved in the EU, you don't manage to understand everything. So it's, and just to give you some examples, you not only have EU institutions, you also have something which is called extra EU institutions and contracts, and para-EU institution and contracts. So, for instance, the stability, Pact of Stability and Growth, and is, for instance, extra EU institution, because you know that originally Britain and Czech Republic didn't participate. Schengen is an institution which is also not a typical EU institution, because Switzerland is participate in it. These firewalls against the crisis of the Eurozone, this ESM and EFSF, etc., are also based on intergovernmental contracts. So even many prime ministers in Europe don't understand these things in detail. So how can you explain all these very complicated network of institutions and contracts to the citizen? Second problem is that EU is it's a very unique system. It's not so ordinary people who they understand what the state is. They might understand what federation is. They must understand what confederation is. But somehow they still feel, even though they don't have to understand it in depth, but they must somehow. It's often called this way, that EU is an experiment and EU is a project. It's often called a project, and even Eurozone is called a project. So if something is a project and or experiment, it's very, very complicated once again to explain to people that it's better than something like which sounds more understandable, like a state or federation or something like that. But I would speak about it later on in detail, I hope. So I think it was enough for the beginning.
Let's go on with Mr. Yannick.
Thank you very much for being invited here. I'm Szabolcs Yannick, Deputy Director of the Migration Research Institute. So my presence here is interesting, but it was a pleasure to accept it, actually. So as for Euroscepticism, I think first of all there are some conceptual problems. Who are Eurosceptic? Parties, governments. Well, we can see that each member state, each government has its debates actually with the institutions of the EU, depending, of course, on their specific situation, the nature, the policy area in which we can see those debates. And I think this is a normal state of the functioning of the EU. Well, what is new here these days is the different types of crises following each other. it started with the financial economic crisis here in 2008, and now this has been followed by a migration crisis actually. So what we see here are some kind of new cleavages emerging on the level of the peoples of Europe and actually on the level of governments. So I think the conflicts are encoded in the system. So what we see here is a fight of interests among the member states seeking alliances, and I think this is not a new phenomenon actually, but the migration crisis was able to make these come to the surface actually. So I think that's one point. Of course, it's worth to make a differentiation between the level of people and the level of politics. Of course, these two need to follow each other, because those political powers who disregard the opinion of their people will lose the ability to govern and be in a position. So I think this is an important difference here. And what we see that the EU could successfully manage the financial crisis. Look at what we have here. We have banking union to be built up in the Eurozone, a common system of financial authorities. So I think that the EU is able to recover and continue its way, of course, based on the cooperation's opinions of the member states. What we see here with regard to the migration crisis may be somehow different, and I think this will have its impact on the future of the EU itself. And we'll see later, and if you have other questions, we'll go into details.
Now the turn is Mr. Non.
Many thanks. Good afternoon to everyone. Jó napot kívánok mindenkinek. Indeed, so just for the precision, I'm French, but I now share my life between Ljubljana and Budapest. So several types of Euroscepticism have been mentioned. Euroscepticism due to ideological reasons, because the EU is too complicated, or maybe because of the system itself. I would like to mention a fourth category of Euroscepticism, and it's a very tricky one because it's due to fatigue, to tiredness, both inside and outside the European Union. And I would like to take an example in the EU enlargement. There is a paradox here. The enlargement of the European Union is most probably the most successful policy ever started by the European Union. It's a part of the European project. I spend my time between Slovenia and Hungary. I know much more Slovenia, which has extremely well used the enlargement and the opportunities that have been provided by enlargement, both to make its voice heard at the European level, but also in terms of economic development and growth. But on the other side, the enlargement policy seems to be the only policy which is opposed by a majority of Europeans. Actually, I think, according to the last Eurobarometer, 44% of Europeans are in favor of enlargement and 46% against. More Europeans are in favor of a common migration policy than enlargement. So migration policy is more popular in the EU than enlargement itself. So where are we now? We have a couple of states which are now candidates to enter the European Union. Officially Serbia, Montenegro, Albania, the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, and Turkey. Two others would like very much to join the club of official candidates, Bosnia and Herzegovina and Kosovo. And another one is still hesitating, but rather outside than inside, and this is Iceland. Today, the situation might not look very bright on the ground. European Union is trying to deal with different crises. All of them have been mentioned since the beginning of this day. And on the Western Balkan side, we can also see that economic development, governance, good neighborly relations are at a standstill. On the other side, we have never invested that much in enlargement. So what causes this standstill? Why is this process paralyzed, and why do we have so many issues in extending the European Union towards this last, let's say, bunch of states? We have here Euroscepticism inside the European Union. I have mentioned it, but also outside. So in those states themselves who clearly want to enter the European Union, the support towards the European Union is slowly fading, sometimes going up, sometimes going down, according to the events that take place, the progresses, and the steps backward. I would like just to mention 3 factors that cause this fatigue. The first one is a lack of perception and a lack of pedagogy, both on the side of the EU and on the side of the Western Balkans. We don't really understand each other, in spite of all the common history we have, all the common policies and the common projects. This is something we could work on. The second thing is a lack of vision, because we are talking, of course, very pragmatically about what are the next steps to take right now, but what is the European Union as it must look like in 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. We are talking a lot about the influence of China in the Western Balkans. I think with the Silk Road project, China has a strategy for 500 years, maybe 1,000 years, while we're still thinking about whether Serbia would enter the EU in 2025 or 2030. And the last issue, which is, I think, the paramount issue we should focus on, is a lack of trust. Trust is something that the whole enlargement process has been based on. The states who want to enter do progress, move forward. The European Union grants rewards, visa liberalization, candidate status, and so on and so forth. And I think this is this trust that we should rebuild again. I think this is it for now. Many thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for the great contributions. Since we are many scholars here, and also in the opening address speech of our president, Mr. Bilaba, he said that he or we are expecting certain scholarly debates which are based on facts and scientific issues. I thought to bring 3 research results here. One is or was conducted by Századvég Foundation, Hungarian think tank. It's called Project 28. The second one is a Eurobarometer research, and the third one is a parliamentary research conducted by the European Parliament. So let's focus at first on Project 28 research results. Basically, I would like to highlight 2 questions or 2 results. One that deals with national sovereignty, and the second one which deals with the question of trust. So according to the first sentence or the first result, most member states are in favor of strengthening national sovereignty, while only 8 countries have a relative majority who favor stronger EU integration. These countries are Spain, Luxembourg, Cyprus, Slovenia, Romania, Malta, Lithuania, and Belgium. And according to the second remark, 50% of the respondents are pessimistic about the distant future. As they see it, their children and the future generations will live in worse conditions than those of today. What is your opinion about these 2 results? Let's start again with Mr. Mahacek.
Okay, I think it's clearly connected with what I said, like, because people don't know what they are being asked about, and they don't understand the questions, and they are confused about it. Because if you speak about more integration of Europe, like if it's just a purpose in itself or a goal in itself, it doesn't make sense. So we should always know what are the goals, what we need to achieve, and then we should differentiate if it's better done on common European level from the center somehow, or if it's better done through the principle of subsidiarity by the nation state. But if you say, like, just like want more European integration, without asking why. So you shouldn't be surprised that people react to it negatively. And I would like to now specifically in connection with that speak about migration, because it's somehow clear, especially for the new member states, it is clear, paradoxically, that any entity like EU should properly protect its outer borders, so that, and we don't have to speak about if we are for or against migration, but let's assume that we are against illegal migration or uncontrolled illegal migration. So protecting the outer border of Europe properly should be a, seems to us in for instance V4 or former communist Europe, to most states it seems to be like a common sense thing that there shouldn't be any dispute about it. But how it should be arranged, then it's a big question. Should it be arranged by giving more powers to institutions like Frontex, or should it be arranged more by giving more resources to particular national states? It is clear, for instance, that in the case of the United States of America, they give like 40 billion crowns to protection of their outer borders. $40 billion to protection of that for their outer borders annually. So perhaps the similar amount should be spent by EU to protect its outer borders, maybe even more, since our border is more complicated. And so, but look at current situation. There is a discussion about the next European budget, if to give more resources to Frontex. So EU starts a discussion if we should give more resources to Frontex without defining the role of Frontex. So if Frontex is really protecting the outer border, if it really is fighting the smugglers, if it's really fighting illegal migration, that might be okay. But there are like some people are quite justifiably worried that if you give more resources to Frontex, they would just like save more migrants from the sea, from the inflatable boats, and import them into the European Union. So I think if we see more rational approach, that we start first, which says, let's first start to discuss what is the purpose of Frontex, why we need a Frontex, and only after that to discuss why we need bigger budget from Frontex. People will consider it more rational. But somehow the debates, many debates in Europe with migration, first point are very complicated and people don't understand it. And again, it's like what most of the Western European countries are emphasizing, that the protection of outer border is less important for them, and for them is something important like some more solidarity, more distribution of migrants across Europe, which from common sense point of view also doesn't make much sense. If you look at, it was in the opening presentation mentioned, look at unemployment in Spain and Italy, of young people, unemployment above 30%. And these people would never go to Hungary or Czech Republic where they would be welcomed, and we would be happy to have more Italian cooks in Czech Republic or in Hungary, but they would never come here given the level of wages in Central Europe, so it's not interesting. So it's better for them to stay on social welfare. So how come anyone think that migrants which would be distributed across Europe would stay in some country with much lower level of wages and much lower level of social welfare, like Slovakia, Czech Republic, Poland? They immediately would go to Western Europe. So there is it doesn't make sense to say that based on solidarity you will accept more migrants into Central Europe, because the day after you would host them or accept them into your country, they would go say goodbye and they would go to Germany. So somehow people, based on common sense, see some discussions and decision making in the EU as very complicated and hard to understand, and they feel that it's not based on common sense very often. So that was just a case of migration. We can speak also about Eurozone in a similar manner, which we might touch later. Sorry for being too long.
Mr. Yannick?
Thank you again. Well, I think these are very, very interesting figures, and I offer you the remaining results also. You should have a look at it because these are very, very interesting survey results. Well, I think that how people feel about their EU membership, their future in the EU, of course, depends on their actual situation, their perceptions, what they see around them. And I'd like to jump back what I've said to your previous question, that we had a very severe economic crisis in the EU in a decade time, and now we have this migration issue here. So if a European, or a Western European, or an Eastern European EU citizen wishes to find something to worry about, actually they will find it. So this can give some reasons for these data. However, I think that the support for EU membership and the faith in a brighter future for Europe depends on, I think, the specific policy area we are talking about. Is this the economic issues? Is this migration? Is this enlargement? I think what we see here is a selective approach pursued by the governments, and what people think about this depends on what we are talking about. Of course, we can say that there's a general support for the EU as a project to be continued in the future, but I think this selective approach is appreciating and has been appreciating much since the migration crisis. And I think that being pessimistic about the future of the EU may be also a cultural issue. I think these are newer generations, and their expectations may differ from their parents or grandparents, respective ones. So I think this is a very, very complex issue, and there are other surveys in this field. And as far as I remember, when people were asked in all member states whether they would remain in the EU with their own countries, V4 people produced the highest shares for that, staying in the EU, and claiming that EU membership is a good thing. So support for the EU here in the V4s is very, very high as compared to other parts of the EU. So I think this is a complex question.
Many thanks. So, according to the first poll, the first result, if I understood correctly, 20 member states are in favor of strengthening national sovereignty, and only 8 would like more integrated EU. And this is really interesting when you look at the countries which are in favor of a better and deeper integration. You have Slovenia, you have Luxembourg, Spain, Romania, and it's quite difficult to identify the pattern, why those states and not others. Another thing that we should have in mind when looking at those results is what kind of question is asked and what kind of feeling do we refer to. So the results would be really different if we had asked, do you have a good opinion of the European Union, or maybe what is your level of trust in the EU? I'm thinking once again about Slovenia, which is considered to be a really pro-European country, which has never tried to hamper deeper integration, but paradoxically was never completely federalist, never wanted to have a completely integrated European Union, and didn't really want to think about United States of Europe. And I think that according to some Eurobarometers, Slovenia is among the least trustful member states in the European Union, I think next to France. So why this result? I think there is some kind of reluctance in this. So we are all aware of the need to stay in the European Union, but of course the problem starts when we think about the future, what to implement, why are we in, and this is something the European Union really needs to answer with concrete actions, concrete projects, and concrete policies. So of course, if the European Union cannot decide how to face a banking crisis, budget crisis, migration crisis, and that it ends up in individual states taking strong, effective, but national solutions? Of course, the people would favor a rather national solution and a stronger national sovereignty. So now on the second poll, we showed that 50% of respondents had a rather pessimistic view of the future. I would like to follow up on what Yannick Szabolcs has said as regards the fact that we are now facing a younger generation. And I do think there is actually a big problem of communication, both from the European Union and from the member states as the future. If you look, of course, at economic indicators, the situation is not that grim. We are still extremely lucky in the European Union. So why this pessimism? And I think there is a problem with the way Europe tries to share positive messages. What do we hear from Brussels? We hear that the European Union has guaranteed peace. This is something that doesn't mean a lot to people slightly younger than me. They talk about good neighborly relations. This is something so obvious for younger generations that we don't think about it anymore, and younger generations are not sensitive about anymore. The same about free circulation. This is something which is taken for granted. So people will not support more the European Union if the EU vehiculates these messages. Those are messages which might be effective still with older generation and with the previous period. I will just share an anecdote. I'm more or less the same age as the Republic of Slovenia. That can give you some clue. 2 years ago, I went back to France for holidays. I took the plane to Frankfurt and then the bus to Strasbourg, which is my hometown. And this was in the spring 2016, so 6 months after the terrorist attacks in Paris. This was something that was triggering a very heated debate in France, but after some time we stopped thinking about it in many places in Europe. I'm in the bus, it's midnight, we are getting close to the border. All of a sudden the bus stops. Policemen are entering the bus and checking the ID card of all the passengers. And this is something I had never experienced in my whole life. Getting back to my country and having a policeman checking my ID, asking exactly why I'm coming back to France, asking why is my address in Slovenia, what am I doing in Slovenia, what am I going to do in France. This is just an example to show that talking about peace, about free circulation, talking about the very basis of the European Union might not have such an impact as it had in the past. So what's the solution? Maybe getting closer to the needs of younger generations, looking at the polls a little bit more than what we might do usually, talking about migrations very openly, and talking about what we want to do with this. This is it from me for now. Many thanks.
Thank you. So the second survey that I would like to deal with is a Eurobarometer survey focusing on a little bit softer topic, culture, cultural heritage and identity, according to which the vast majority of Europeans, 84%, feel that cultural heritage is important and 90% believe that it is important to their country as well. Do you think that there is something like European identity?
Of course, I said at the beginning that I was taking care of Václav Havel's heritage, so his thinking is obviously very close to mine in this respect. So some of his important ideas were like that you will quickly, it depends where you are on the planet. And if you are a European and you travel, for instance, to Saudi Arabia, which is, as we could have witnessed recently, it's kind of a Middle Ages, really medieval society with modern technology. So suddenly you would feel very European. You would feel more European than Czech or Hungarian or something. And if you go to Greenland to visit it and speak with native people in Greenland who live in snow houses, perhaps you would feel very European. And but to be more serious, he was trying to emphasize that identities don't exclude each other. Identities are in concentric circles, and identities can easily strengthen each other and don't they don't have to exclude one another. So your identity, for instance, in my case, would be I was born in the city of Prague. I am also Czech. I am also perhaps Central European. I am European, etc., etc. And you can have many identities, and it's very important that one is aware of its roots and he knows where he is coming from, and he is open enough to realize that taking other identities doesn't mean to push other identity to the corner. So it's people should just be more enlightened in this and more aware of the fact that Europe is not excluding national state or national identity and vice versa. So you can easily be both, and it just needs to be more open and enlightened in this respect.
Thank you again. Well, I think if you ask any person from any member state what you are, actually, the answer will come first, of course, the nationality in question. And I think this is normal. And it can be complemented by being a proud European, I think. But there's a precondition for that, namely, if the EU has something to offer, values, achievements to be proud of, then of course I think more and more people will feel to be a proud European, actually. So this is a question like this, and I think that the EU itself is a special form of integration. Namely, there are 28 different set of values, histories, interests, and this is a difficult question whether it is a justified expectation against the member states to be, okay, we are all Europeans and we are very proud of it. Where in the meantime we know that there are different interests, different policy areas, and of course this is a fight of interest in the background. Let's see at the EU summits in Brussels. So I think this is not that easy to be a unified European citizen for any of the member states people. And well, I think that the current leaders of the EU make some very specific mistakes when the president of the European Commission says that Romania's unity is something to be celebrated on EU level, which is, I think, a nonsense, and it's not right, and it doesn't have unity among the member states. We should seek ways to be united, but I think that making this occasion a celebration for all of us is not the right thing, I think. So I think there are concrete errors in the system and misbeliefs, and this is a total lack of understanding the history of Central and Eastern Europe, and this is not the right thing, I think.
Thank you. European identity. I think that could be a good topic for a European-wide referendum. That's really weird, because when I started thinking about cultural heritage, the first thing that came to my mind is culture as an EU policy. And if we look into the treaties, there are three kinds of competencies for the EU: exclusive for the EU, shared between the EU and the member states, or coordination and support policy. And such is culture. So already in the, let's say, constitutional or institutional architecture of the European integration, culture is something that Europe should coordinate, foster, support, but not rule upon. However, I think there is some kind of misunderstanding as regards the EU identity. As Mr. Mahacek mentioned, this works in concentric circles. Identity might also change with time, and stronger and more assertive European Union and European culture doesn't mean necessarily that the national identities would recede and would shrink. I think instead of thinking whether the European identity might overlap or overtake national identities, maybe we should just assume that it's up to the states, to the regions, to the cities, to the villages, to the families to assert their identities in a very positive manner. This is probably the best way to ensure that we can coexist together without any major conflict and without any major existential question. This is it for now.
Thank you. And the third research result is the Parliameter 2018 result that basically was the very first thing that I have found on the internet, even without searching for it. I just bumped into it and surprised me very much, according to which nowadays, I mean this year in 2018, the support of the EU on a national level, I mean like among people, among European people, has reached a record level, 68%. Basically never before has it been so high. 1 year ago, so in 2017, it was around 50%. And in 2014, when they carried the same survey for the European parliamentary elections, they got a result of 30%. So now when we are basically sitting on a conference when we discuss about Euroscepticism, and we have talked about different types of Euroscepticism, how would you explain these very high results?
I don't know. I'm myself not in favor of these very general questions in the polls. So starting with some positive news, for instance, in Czech Republic, which is one of the most Eurosceptic countries, according to the polls, like the support for EU is started to grow recently. Not dramatically, but it's steadily growing for the last 2 years, so perhaps it's getting better. But it's always, even though I don't like the stereotypes, it's always based into an extent on the national character. And Czechs, above all, like are really skeptic people, which some people would say like cynical, but it's also good because they are not easily manipulated. You wouldn't easily vote for some leader who is gonna get like 70% like in Poland or etc. So they are not inclined to believe in some like winning ideologies or fanatism, but this skepticism that they are skeptical of everything and they constantly complain. Czechs are complaining that if you are a shop owner, you complain that you have so many customers, and or if you have an empty store, you complain that you have no customers, and people are constantly mumbling against everything, and it's part of a Czech national character. So if you ask people about EU, obviously they would complain because that's the way they are. That's the way we are, more than other nations. Even though, as I said, like it's a stereotype. So if you would ask like much more specific questions, if you would ask young people, would you agree that you cannot go on, even though Erasmus is not exactly an EU program, so that I said at the beginning, everything is more complicated. And so if you would ask young people, would you agree that you cannot use Erasmus anymore and you couldn't travel to Britain or Spain to spend a semester? Would you agree that it will be cancelled? Would you agree that you have to use your passport traveling across the borders and wait in line? Would you, etc., etc.? If you would ask these specific questions, if you people in the countryside, where actually, even though I am not myself an enthusiast for common agriculture policy, living standards of people working in agriculture in Central European countries after entering the EU increased enormously, and the quality of their work and quality of their life, whatever. So if you would ask them, would you like to go back to the system which was here before entering the EU, most people in villages perhaps wouldn't agree. So plus there is the first and foremost thing that it's a peace project, so it should be, if it's more emphasized that Europe is a peace project, and so it would also be very helpful.
Well, I think what these numbers suggest is that people see and are aware of the benefits and values of the EU. The EU offers, going from the Schengen system to the economic advantages, the EU funds, this whole welfare thing, and the common values it offers, democracy, etc. So I think that most Europeans see these benefits, and they wish to still belong to this exclusive club, the most successful integration in the world. That's one thing. But as in a marriage, for example, when people, husband and wife, quarrel with each other, they have problems, but they do not wish to run to the lawyers and divorce. So I think that the fact that we have debates with Brussels, with other member states, doesn't necessarily mean that we wish to quit the EU immediately. So I think that these are two very different things, and as I've already mentioned, there are problems, there are challenges, there are 28 types of interests and expectations within the EU. So this is something that we have to respect and find the best common points and solutions that at least the majority of the member states can support.
So finally, some good news after everything we've been talking about previously. This might show that we are reluctant believers, exactly like in a marriage. We might have more frustrations than pleasant times. We might really have tough times, but in the end, we would never go to the lawyer, unless in a very extreme case, or if there was really a clear problem with the initial choice. People will probably, for still decades, want to stay in the European Union, whatever it becomes, because there is some instinct here that outside the weather is quite cold, and that we should rather try and reform the things from the inside, and we should try to maybe change the base, change the system, but at no rate leave it. It also shows that people are waiting for the European Union. They are really sensitive to European issues. They want things maybe to be proposed at the European scales, but consistent, solid things. And I would like to add on what has been mentioned, some polls which have been conducted in the Western Balkans by the Regional Cooperation Council, which supervises the region. What happens in 2 years since 2016? Some more improvement of the economic situations, some more summits, something called the Berlin process, which has tried to to enhance progresses on the ground. Maybe prospects of some kind of resolution for the name conflict in Macedonia, and of the Kosovo-Serbia issue. In those 2 years, the level of support for the European Union has increased by 10 percentage points. So from 39% in 2016 to 49% in 2018. It really shows a high sensitiveness. And maybe one last point on Kosovo. I don't know if many of you have been to Kosovo. It's an extremely positive country which has quite a lot of economic, financial, political challenges and also existential difficulties to face. But in Kosovo, according to a recent poll, 43% of the people think they will join the EU by 2020. Almost half think that Kosovo will be a member of the European Union in 1.5 years, while Serbia is in negotiations to enter for 6 years, Macedonia more than 10. So I think all those polls show that there is something which has to be proposed by the European Union, but we might need a better way to reboot the system, to address new challenges, to address challenges that are really relevant for the people.
Thank you. So after research, let's go on with some ideological aspects of the EU or of the future of Europe. Since we are here in Hungary, a region that is part of V4, Visegrad 4 countries, it has already been mentioned by some of you. How do you see the role of this cooperation or this group of countries in the future of Europe? can it solve, let's say, can it hinder or foster Euroscepticism? How can it add to Europe, the European Union as such?
So, Visegrad countries. I think it seems now that there is that V4 countries are very united or cooperate a lot, but it's just because of the migration that there is no other common agenda than the skepticism towards mandatory quotas or refusal of mandatory quotas or permanent redistribution mechanism for migrants, from the reasons which I myself agree with, that it's not. There are perhaps different levels of nationalism that we in Czech Republic don't speak about protecting the whatever European Christianity or Christianity and national culture, but we speak more about security or that rules should be obliged, and that there are no rights to enter some countries or some regions like illegally by marching in, as we can see these days that there is also an Americans call it a caravan going through the Central America, demanding the access to the US. So we experience something similar. So even though migrants are avoiding the territory of Czech Republic from economic reasons, which I explained before, people are somehow allergic to the fact that someone is illegally marching through something, demanding something for she doesn't have any legal right whatsoever. It's not true that people in Czech Republic are against minorities or migration. Our society is very diversified. We have actually higher number of citizens from out of the EU per capita than France, for instance. We have a huge number of Vietnamese and Mongolians and obviously Ukrainians and etc. And people are not afraid of them because they are because they know they are working hard and they don't represent any security danger for the citizens. But going back to V4, so this is where we differ. So we emphasize like that we don't like illegal migration and from security reasons, but this is the same with few little exceptions for whole of V4. But otherwise, I don't see any common interest or common agenda, because sooner or later migration will stop being a number one problem of the European Union. It will always be a big problem and big challenge, but sooner or later you will, when the recession comes again or some economic crisis, you will the fact that even given all these reforms my colleague mentioned, these reforms are not enough, so Eurozone will become one more again the biggest problem. Italian banking system would be a very big problem. So at this moment, V4. I think it's very important that we have V4. I should say, on the other hand, I'm not a V4 skeptic, but it's by far like you cannot even compare it. That it's not a substitute for the EU, or it should never like even compete with the fact. But I think that it's good that we have some groupings which have a common history. Not only like good neighbors, good neighborly relationship, but we all experience communism and totalitarian regime. It's an interesting added value for being a member of the European Union, because we experience something. And from historical reasons, there is good that there is also some entity in which you don't have Germans and Austrians. You don't have to have Germans in everything, right? Like, so that it's possible to have something without Germans also. And it's good, but we shouldn't like overestimate, over we should make it like more important than it deserves. There should be more cooperation in culture, infrastructure, etc. But there are no real common interests besides opposing the mandatory quota system for the distribution of migrants. We are good neighbors. We want to be good neighbors. Always should have good relationships. It's a basis of freedom and prosperity, and also of the EU, like a peaceful project, that we have good relationship with neighbors. So V4 is good for it, like another instrument, but it should improve its infrastructure connections, but more of the business is going east-west than north-south, so it's economically not that demanding to improve the connections, for instance, between Poland and Czech Republic. It is, but it's not dictated by number one economic interests. And so it's important also as a culture institution, etc. But there are not, once again, there are not any common interests besides, at the moment, besides opposing the permanent redistribution mechanism of migrants.
Thank you. Well, we had to wait 24 years to have an issue first for the V4s to be united and aligned and it was migration, because but it has its own historical reasons why these countries are so sensitive to the question of migration. First of all, we lived nearly half a century in a dictatorship, and we are very sensitive to, let's call these forced decisions coming from outside the territory of these countries. Here, Brussels, of course, which is very, very different from what we had for 50 years in the region, but people could feel sensitive about this. And well, these are very homogeneous societies. We don't have too much minorities and great share of minorities as a general rule in the region. So these are.
I said to you that it's not true at the beginning of my presentation. We have quite a lot of minorities.
Well, but if we compare it with other, for example, Western
more
European.
minorities than France. I saw to you that the Czech Republic has per capita more foreigners with permanent residency or temporary residency per capita than France.
Well, okay,
out
but
of EU.
Well, okay, that's
just the myth. It's not true.
I know, but well, if we look at, for example, Hungary, Poland, Slovakia, these are homogeneous nation states. As compared to, for example, other Western European countries, this is I think this is a true statement. And multiculturalism here was not a question and not an issue for 50 years, because we were part of the Soviet Union's interest sphere. So I think that we have another historical background here in Central Eastern Europe, and this is what many member states and sometimes seems that Brussels either don't understand actually why we are so sensitive about this, and why the rejection of mandatory quotas, a common migration policy, is so highly rejected in the region. I think so that's why this is sensitive. And the migration as a topic was also able to give some extra weight for these countries on the European scene and in the European arena, and this is a possibility for these countries to use in the future. And actually, what we see is yes, they can shape the public debate in also in other minor issues. I don't know how these countries will be able to use it for other purposes. This extra weight gained in the topic of migration, but we will see. And of course, this will determine what the future of the V4 will be. And we have some very interesting initiatives, a common TV channel for the V4s, a regional development bank. These are very interesting initiatives. We'll see how this can be realized in the future.
Can I a bit something technical? Okay. So to repeat it more specifically, I explained already that we have, for instance, small retail like shops in Czech Republic are completely controlled by Vietnamese minority. I said we have a really like around 200,000 of them which are not citizens. Plus we have a huge number of them who are already citizens. Chinese, Mongolians, Ukrainians. It's a absolute. Czech Republic is absolutely on the level of Western European countries, given foreigners are, given the number of foreigners. This is just a myth, and people are absolutely welcoming and not opposing sustained and gradual level, natural level of migration, because somehow people come into the country, but people are absolutely allergic, and it's not populists who are provoking it. People are absolutely allergic that someone is marching in some caravan and demanding the entrance and the right to enter your country. People are absolutely allergic with it because we have a lack of labor at the moment, for instance, and Ukrainians who want to come to our country to work have to wait for a long time to get a permit, and then someone would come and say, well, I have a right to go just through or to stay in your country. So these are two different things. So if the level is gradual, sustainable, people get used to it gradually, they are okay with it.
Okay, sorry. 1 second. Okay, now I see your point. But beside the presence of 200,000, okay, Vietnamese, etc., these are not multicultural. So let me correct myself, and we agree. I think the countries in the region are not multicultural societies. These are, if we wish to classify them into categories, we are homogeneous nation states. That was what I said, and that is a historical feature of the region that must be respected. And of course, there are other nations coming. Yes, we could ask the Polish about the Ukrainians coming to work in their countries. Of course we have our Asian minorities also here in Hungary. So that's the point, I think, and we could agree.
And this is very interesting because in the European public debate, we tend to consider France as an example of a heterogeneous and multicultural society, as opposed to, let's say, some V4 members. But just for the anecdote, still, let's remember that France is one of the rare European countries which doesn't recognize the concept of minority and hasn't signed many of the European texts linked to minority status and minority languages. So on the V4, what can a Frenchman see when hearing about the V4? Common history, common geography, common traumas, some mutual wars, economic challenges, which are also common forced decisions, common, let's say, society structure. Well, I think that some federal states have been built on less than that. So after that, in the European Union, we will always find groups and alliances, which might change with the time, and this is not necessarily a problem. We have Benelux, we had the French-German partnership, we had the Weimar Triangle with the France, Germany, and Poland. Now we have the V4, and many other alliances can arise in the future. Indeed, the V4 has been quite vocal on the topic of migrations, but I would be a little bit less pessimistic regarding the range of issues that the V4 can tackle. One of them, I think, and this happened last year, was the question of double standards in the food industry or something like that, on which the V4 has been quite vocal. I also have in mind the Visegrad Fund, which also is financing various projects. And just for the anecdote also, I've been working on some topics linked to V4, among others, the relationships between V4 and Slovenia, because Slovenia has for a time wanted to join the V4. And I was really happy to write an article about how Slovenia is a very special partner for the V4, and I interviewed a couple of academics on this issue. And everyone replied to me, well, V4+1, it works with everyone. Look, Austria is talking to the V4. The Baltic states are talking to the V4. Japan is talking to the V4. Israel is talking to the V4. So I think this shows that the V4 has really the potential to punch above its weight, and not only on the issues of migration. Of course, it will not become, most probably not, a new organization, let's say, comparable to the EU, because this wouldn't have any sense. It will probably not become a completely politically homogeneous group, since the chances that all the governments are of the same political color are still quite slim. But I still see some potential in tackling many issues ranging from economic to political and so on and so forth. One of them being the enlargement. I still think that many countries that are right now in leadership in relation to the enlargement might not completely understand the situation in the Western Balkans. Maybe let's turn to countries like Hungary, which has a common border with, let's say, 2.5, 3.5 Balkan countries. So there is potential in here.
Just one more technical, because it's my favorite topic. Sorry. So I'm absolutely for a competition of colorful competition of little regional groupings, which can get different overlappings. With, for instance, there is also an Austerlitz format of Austria, Slovakia, Czech Republic together with France, etc. So you can have many other things. Poles, you know, they have these ambitions of like 6 Cs initiatives, which is, I think, not very successful, but because nobody wants to be led by Poles that much. But it's actually interesting. When I visited South Korea a few years ago, they were very much in favor of V4 because they have auto factories in most of the countries, and they really saw a big potential. They even organized a huge, prestigious concert of V4 Korea cooperation. But somehow they pulled back just because they realized it became like very toxic trademark in Western Europe, unfortunately. But there is one more issue which these countries definitely have in common, that, for instance, their banking sector is fully controlled by the banks from the Western Europe or the US. They don't have their own banking, and people are complaining about all these huge outflow of dividends and low wages, but it doesn't really constitute a common interest, you know, to like we should have higher wages. Okay, so how to arrange it, you know, like it's you cannot probably do it through V4. So.
Okay, thank you. Another question that might cause a little debate. Since we have narrowed down the topic to 4 countries, let's now concentrate only on one country, Hungary. Hungary, which I think has a special role in current Europe. I have a quotation from Henry Kissinger, who says that almost as if according to some natural law, in every century there seems to emerge a country with the power, the will, and the intellectual and moral impetus to shape the entire international system in accordance with its own values. Can Hungary be this country in the future of Europe?
I'm not much enthusiastic to start with this. I don't know. I think probably that it's not a big enough country to do it, and even though it seems to me that so there are bigger countries to change the picture, like Italy with current government is perhaps going to be much more important player. And we really will see what happens, like with the European elections, and after the European elections, I don't expect any changes before in forming the factions in European Parliament before the elections. But if the result is dramatic or in a certain way negative, we could we could witness some regroupings after the elections. But this idea, which perhaps both of these gentlemen would like it, Mr. Macron on one hand and Mr. Orban on the other hand, like to be like the representing like 2 camps in Europe. I think it seems to me that Hungarians are a little bit overemphasizing their importance, even though they have an ideology. And but there's also Mr. Salvini, and his country is like 6 times bigger, right? So we'll see what's going to happen.
I agree with the previous saying, namely that the weight of a country still matters, of course, within the EU. If you look at the decision-making structure and rules of the Council, and so that's the natural order of EU decision-making. But what Hungary and the current government could achieve is that Hungary could make his narrative and agenda an alternative to talk about, actually, and it was a good tool to be able to step on the stage of the European politics, high politics. So, and of course, this means a capital for the future for both Hungary and the V4 integration as well. And we'll see how this capital could be used in the future.
Thanks. Well, as for the country which is about to define the dominant values and system of thought in the world, indeed, we might assume that China has a bit more chances than Hungary or the US or India whatsoever. However, I still think that Hungary could be a leader in the European Union, but I wish also for Slovenia to be a leader of the European Union, for France, for Poland, and for so many other countries. We have already some mechanisms that guarantee this. It's called the turning presidency of the EU Council. Every 6 months, a country decides to take the reins and to lead the agenda for a couple of months, as far as the EU Council is concerned. Another thing that we might think about is that each country has its own expertise, its own good examples to showcase, and its own ideal policies. So why not trusting each of the EU 28 countries with a specific policy that it could be a leader on? And right now, let's make only our stereotypes work. Slovenia could be a leader in energy, circular economy, environment. Hungary could be a leader on, let's say, migration, culture policies. France could be a leader on security, on counter-terrorism, and so on and so forth. So to that extent, I assume that Hungary can indeed be a leader in Europe, but only if all the member states are as well at the same time through the EU as a whole.
Thank you. And finally, as a closing round, I would like to quote or to refer to what Larry Kaiser said, a question about our attitude towards the European Union. Do we really do everything for Europe, or is it really Europe that is guilty for everything? Concerning Euroscepticism. What should we do better, we as citizens of Europe?
Well, I don't know. I would only repeat myself that we should demand more simplicity and more efficiency, and I think I am myself a sort of cute, for instance, cute Euro-federalist not cute that I don't believe in anymore, but I'm absolutely skeptical that anyone is able to explain what federalism is. And federalism is not centralism. And in my view, it's based on in a competition. It's based on the protection of small entities through the idea of upper chamber or Senate or whatever. And so it's. But we in Europe don't even know we don't speak it at the same language. French tend to think that federalism is centralism. If you would speak with people in the UK, they would probably think that it's a decentralization because they call federalism like giving the more powers to asymmetrical powers to parliaments in Wales and Scotland. So we don't even know what we speak about. So, and I think this federalism would enable this more efficiency, simplicity, And but on the other hand, I don't see any political leader on the horizon who would be able to explain this to normal people and normal citizens. But perhaps so we have to believe in going like small, step by step. And in this respect, I agree with the previous speech of Mr. Juncker in last September, when he sort of was trying to explain that Eurozone should be for everybody somehow, sooner or later, because it should be a currency of the European Union, and Schengen should be for everybody. And so if you go step by step in this, you will make the whole system more understandable, because it's absolutely overcomplicated. And if it's overcomplicated, it will always enable the politicians to blame all the failures on Brussels and all the successes, and to privatize all the successes for their own political purposes.
Well, if we seek the chances of an average EU citizen, how he or she could affect the development of the integration, of course we won't really find direct possibilities for these people. What we can do indirectly is to elect our parties, governments, and who will represent us in the EU, and will support or reject various decisions in policy areas. So this is the most and the most practical thing that an average EU citizen could do. But I think that this is a two-way responsibility. Of course, once elected, the government and the various institutions of the EU have to show an example, have to set values for the people, communicate much better than it actually sometimes does. So I think the major responsibility lies with the EU itself in this process. And of course, this can be followed by the people of Europe and the various nation states. But I think that setting an example is a task for Brussels and the different bodies of the EU.
Just to sum up, so Jan Mahacek mentioned the need to be more simple and more efficient at the European level. On the other hand, I assume also that the citizens have to get more into the details, to look for the facts, to look for information, and to be able to think about it. And this is something that no one else than us can do. No one can force someone to go on the internet and to start with Wikipedia and then more scientific sources to fill in information for a given debate. Let's have, for example, a very heated debate about migrations, about enlargement, about the future of our economics. I think there is absolutely no problem with that, and we should be really happy to have the most controversial possible discussions on those issues. But let's do it on the basis of facts. Let's do it on the basis of well-informed public, and only with that condition we can move forward. However, I also agree with Yannick Szabolcs that the main responsibility lies on the EU. We need to have clear policies to discuss, because we will not be able to discuss the compromise that was decided at yesterday's meeting of the European Council and that will be sent to the Parliament tomorrow for a second reading. This is not something that we can expect from the citizens to start a debate. So we need to have clear measures and clear steps forward to think on concrete steps. And if we are today in a European Union where nothing can be done to move forward, if no clear action or no clear reform can be thought about, then maybe we might well need to rethink the whole system from the ground. But this is not up to me to discuss this for the moment. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other contribution from your side? Nothing.
Just say the last sentence that if the question in the panel was like if we can fight Euroscepticism with more Europe, I would say that we can fight Euroscepticism with smarter Europe. So this is my slogan.
Great. Thank you. although we are a little bit ahead schedule, but I think it's high time to close this panel. If there are contributions from the audience side, then we are open to answer the questions. Reinhard?
Yes, as always. Thanks a lot, Reinhard Klocek. I'm the Secretary General of Pan-Europa Austria. You provoked this question because you said that the responsibility is on the EU. So my question to you is, what is the EU? I'm asking that question because I don't know how many discussions, and then when people are talking about the EU, you get the impression that they're talking about something that's sitting in Brussels and has nothing to do with the member states. But it's a fact in the European Union that the last one who makes the decision is the member states. So the EU does not exist without the member states. It exists through the member states. So when you say the responsibility is on the EU, what exactly does that mean?
Exactly all the people who are working or have been elected or nominated to the head of EU institutions and which have political power and the power to decide. MEPs, members of the European Parliament, heads of state at the European Council, and members of the European Commission.
I absolutely agree with you that Americans would never think that the United States of America is Washington, D.C. So why is there such an obsession with us Europeans thinking that EU equals Brussels? EU is everything which is happening in good or bad within EU borders. This is EU, like all life or nations, individuals. Everything which is happening within the borders is EU, as it is in the case of the United States. So it should be more explained by the leaders, by the elites to people that everything is EU, not just Brussels.
Well, I think it's worth to differentiate between the various main bodies of the EU, actually. Well, Council is the most simple case because there are the leaders of the governments and there is the decision-making mechanism to be followed. So that's the clearer case. I think the Commission is some kind of different because there are the delegates of each member state responsible for a specific policy area, but later, as a body that initiates various policies, it will start to follow its own logic, because their mandate is to develop and design policies for all member states, and this is a different logic than representing their own country, which is strictly prohibited for these commissioners in the Commission. So I think that if we talk about it's Brussels' fault, it's rather the Commission, I think, because there's a different organizational logic behind the functioning of the Commission, I think.
Can I say an additional word? Many thanks. Just came to my mind. I'm sorry, again, the enlargement policy. I think this is a clear example. The responsibility lies on the European Commission, which is defining the methodology for negotiations, which is proposing the steps to move forward, which is issuing strategies and trying to rethink the whole process. It lies on the member states, which are the ones still deciding mainly to move on with the negotiations. We saw recently that 3 of them were not in favor of moving forward with 2 of the Western Balkan countries. And it's also up to the European Parliament to make its voice heard, maybe gain, who knows, more expertise, more clout, more voice in this debate. So I think we can pretty much identify all the main actors when we say the EU must. Of course we say it because it's easier to say, shorter.
Okay, so I think I have nothing more to do than to thank you for the really great contribution of our fantastic panelists and to invite the audience for the coffee break.